I'd like to start by really asking the same question of every candidate up here, and that is, if you were elected to the legislature, what would be your top 2 priorities or so? And we'll give you about 2 minutes each to respond. I'll start just immediately to my left with Mr. Crowley.
Well, thank you, Oklahoma Watch, as well as Together Oklahoma, for having this particular forum here. Thank you for all of the residents that came out to show their support for a candidate, as well as learn more about us and the issues that we're running on. If I'm elected, number one thing that we're going to do going forward in this 2019 legislative session, we'll make sure that we're fully funding in education. I'm an educator for Lawton Public Schools, football coach at Eisenhower High School, and I believe that that is an important factor here in the state of Oklahoma that we have been neglecting for many years. And it's time now to fully fund education and make sure that education is put on top of the priority. Second thing by far would be tackling criminal justice reform. We've been talking about it. It was on the ballot last 2016 election, and some of those measures passed. But it's time to be realistic and provide funding towards those mental health programs, as well as provide some opportunities in some organizations that are here, some funding as well, so they can be successful in the long run in helping people that have been somewhat subjected towards incarceration throughout our state.
Representative Montgomery. He has a microphone.
Thank you guys all for being here, as always, and entertaining us to listen to our responses to your valuable questions. I always enjoy being able to have these conversations with folks. For me, kind of the top 2 issues, it's going to be a little offbeat from what a lot of people think is the top priority, education. But for me, it's about a stable budget, a growing budget, a sustainable budget, and how we fund the things that we care about. Ultimately, you have to have stability first, and you have to have sufficient resources to pay for the things that you want. There's a saying out there that your budget is kind of your moral document, if you will. It shows what your objectives are. So to me, if you have that stability, you're able to take care of the things that are important, like mental health, like education, and healthcare, and a number of other things that are in the state budget. So that to me is kind of the first thing. We got to get to stability. We do have to have sustainability, make sure that revenue grows over time, and isn't just kind of volatile like a lot of folks think that we should have. So the second issue is healthcare for me. This is a major part of our state budget. There are things that we can innovate on that would cut costs without reducing the quality of care. We have to have a conversation about how long it takes to become a doctor in this country. In other countries, it takes less time to get that same education that it takes here. That's keeping doctors out of our doctors' offices. That's keeping them out of the hospitals. So for me, obviously, budget, healthcare is kind of the big thing. Just looking for those innovations, being able to support sustainable revenue over time as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pay. What would be your top priorities if you were elected to the legislature?
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. I think based on the past couple of years, it should go without saying that budget and education should be the focus for any legislator. For me personally, based on my experiences here in Lawton, what I would focus on as a legislator, number one, veterans, and number two, focusing on the tax code as it relates to cities. So when it comes to veterans, my mom and dad came here from South Korea in '83 and opened up a dry cleaners here in '89. And as a kid, I got to meet a lot of soldiers, a lot of veterans who were stationed here from Fort Sill. And so that's kind of shaped my upbringing. And I've gotten a chance to tour the Veterans Center out there by Flower Mound. I've learned about issues related to healthcare, educational opportunities, and jobs for veterans. And I want to be a representative who focuses on veterans issues. Now, when it comes to cities, having worked in the city manager's office now for over a year, I've learned that Oklahoma is the only state in the entire country where our cities are primarily funded using sales tax revenue. That's an outdated model, and yet we still have not done anything to renew it or change it. And I want to be a legislator or representative who focuses on finding ideas to change that tax code with respect to how we fund our cities, because that's a very important topic, I think, long run, that we need to be focused on as a legislature, and that as a representative I want to be focused on as well.
Mr. Pay, thank you. Mr. Bush, what do you?
Yes, David, thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you, Oklahoma Watch. Thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. I'm always honored and privileged and humbled to be before an audience. So the two issues for me in speaking with constituents, number one is education. Resounding, that's what I hear. Education and funding for education, fully funded for education, not a one-year fix, but to include teacher pay raise, and giving them the tools and supplies that they need to be able to do their job so our kids can get a quality education. That's important to me. That's important to my constituents in District 62. The second issue would be health care. Access to health care and obtaining affordable health care. It used to be that we were concerned about rural hospitals here in Oklahoma, but you see cities like Pauls Valley who have to set up a GoFundMe page to keep their hospitals open. You see continued nursing homes, many nursing homes continue to close. So my grandmother told me that next to your relationship with God and your family, that health's the most important thing. So I think that health care and accepting those Medicaid dollars and bringing them home, I know the hospitals here, they're losing as much as $25 million a year. And so it won't be long before they will continue to have cuts. And we need hospitals. We need access to health care. So that's important.
Thank you. Ms. McCarter, what would be your priorities?
Okay, priority number one for me, oh, and also thank you, I'll be redundant, that thank you, I really do appreciate everybody for being out here today and listening and taking part in this upcoming election and being here to hear what we have to say. It's so important. I am an LPS counselor and I've been an educator for 9 years, and so education is a priority for me. However, I will have to say that we need to ensure that our budget is fixed, that we have sustainable and recurring revenue, because without that, we can't continue to fund education properly. So once we straighten out that budget and we're able to do that, education is my second priority. And I only say second to the budget because without a budget, we can't have a fully funded education system that's working, that's worth anything for us. And with the budget that's working and in check, we're able to do things like criminal justice reform, which I think are so important. We are able to focus on health care, but we've got to make sure that our money is in the right spot and that it's recurring and sustainable, and we're able to put it where it needs to go.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, what would you think is most important to try to accomplish if you're in the legislature?
Thank you. And again, thank you for having us, and thank you everybody in attendance here. So my main issue, I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been set up here, is the budget, and I break that down into two priorities under that. We have to fix the budget to be able to fully fund all of our core services, including education. In order to do that, the two main things that I want to focus on are tax and spending reform, and to do that end, I've created my own tax package that I've drafted. I've looked over the Oklahoma state budget, I've looked over tax laws. I came up with a plan that I think should work better. And the other big thing, as I already mentioned up here, is criminal justice reform. And to push that, I've looked over our state laws, I've read through, we've got thousands of them, and so many of them are, outdated, not needed, and we could just go through and get rid of a lot of them, and it would make things easier for everybody if we did that. So those are my two big goals if I get elected, is fix the tax reform, try to push my tax package to do that, and criminal justice reform, get rid of our outdated and broken laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, David. And again, thank Oklahoma Watch and more specifically, everybody who's taken time out of their day to come here and to listen to what all of us have to say. Being active in the process, I think, is always a good thing, and being a well-informed voter is what we as the electorate need here in our state specifically, but also in our country. So I applaud you and I thank you. My two main priorities, if I had to narrow it down to two things, two of the biggest things over the last 6 months of knocking on doors and talking to people in my community, would be, first and foremost, proper education funding. And not necessarily just teacher pay, but funding in general. And that's so teachers aren't having to buy paper, having to have a lot of extra incurred expenses that has to come out of their own pocket. If you want good fresh oats, you got to buy them before they go through a horse. And I think that's something that we, as legislators, need to concentrate on. The number two most important thing, in my opinion, is in my district, like Mr. Bush was talking about, hospitals are closing. 2 years ago, the hospital in my district closed in Frederick, Oklahoma. Now, if you're in Frederick, you're a 45-minute ambulance ride if you have a heart attack. If if you get your hand caught into PTO on a tractor, if you get your foot ran over by a dozer, something falls on you at the factory down there, the automotive parts factory. It's a huge issue for the people in that community, and I'd like to see that in some way, shape, or form or capacity to be reopened, at least within ER, something along those lines. So in a general sense, I guess that would be healthcare.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up and just go backward, so you can keep your microphone, Mr. Caldwell, and to ask really to look at the needs in your district, the district you're running in, and tell us in just 1 minute, what are people worried most of all? What do they need most of all in your district and in Southwest Oklahoma? You don't even have to tell me the answers or the solutions. I want to see what you know and what you feel about are the concerns of your district.
So my district is predominantly rural. The biggest need in rural Southwest Oklahoma is access to health care, access to medical facilities, access to good doctors. That if you need to go to the doctor, you don't need to have to drive an hour and a half. I think that small, community access to health care, and then also quality education for rural communities. I think we all know here, and all probably agree, that the one true thing that can break the cycle of poverty is quality education. And I think that's one thing that we have a social contract and covenant with the people we represent and the people that we live with in society, that we are going to provide that, at least a starting foundation for our kids. And so I think those are the two biggest things, and they dovetail with those other two issues that we talked about a minute ago.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, in House District 64, same question.
Thank you. When I go around talking to people, here in Lawton, this is my district that we're in right now. A lot of the things they talk to me about are local concerns, and the state government does have, effect on all of those. I hear a lot about the roads and how bad they are, and I hear a lot about how there's just not good jobs here. And so definitely the economy, fixing that, and definitely hoping, like they were saying earlier, with the city funding, hoping to get better funding to the cities for them to be able to, fix those local concerns such as the infrastructure. So those would be the two main priorities that I could see affecting District 64. Thank you.
Ms. McCarter, your response.
Like we said, after knocking doors and talking to many, many people across District 64, and I've even spent some time at my school at Ridgecrest Elementary, which is not my district, but it's always great to hear just concerns about citizens throughout Lawton altogether. Education is #1 priority for everybody I speak to, be it with kids or with no kids in school in Lawton. A lot of those people have come to understand that even if you don't have children in public school, these children who are in our public school are growing up, and they are the ones who are going to be running our society. So education is #1. Like David said, also, it's been a lot of talk about job quality, opportunity. And again, though, a reason that Oklahoma struggles with job opportunity and growing businesses is because our education system is lacking. And before businesses invest in Oklahoma, they want to see that Oklahomans are investing in Oklahoma. So I think it's so important that we keep that in mind when we go into this upcoming election. But again, in 64, I think it's education and job opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Bush, what are you hearing in your district?
What I'm hearing from constituents is education, education, education. It all goes back to education and funding for education and jobs, of course. My district is unique in that it's very diverse culturally and economically. You have one part of the district that there's a big difference in the wealth. And closing that wealth gap, I think education is the key. And as far as jobs, they're concerned about jobs. And when corporations, when they look at states, particularly Oklahoma, they look at now education. Are they investing in their people? They invest in education. And so that has to be a priority because it's going to help with jobs and it's going to secure our future.
Mr. Pay.
Like everyone said so far, I think education has come up quite frequently in my conversations at the door. Specifically, how can we continue to collaborate between Lawton Public Schools, Cameron University, and Great Plains Technology Center? I think we're unique compared to other communities around the state in that we have already a strong existing relationship, but we can do more to continue to build upon that. So certainly robust education, but also robust economic development, jobs for young professionals, jobs to keep people here in the Lawton Fort Sill community, and how do we grow from here? And just last week we had the Wear on Sea event downtown. We had a lot of folks come, a lot of businesses. I think more that type of collaboration among the community is the way to go here at the local level, and certainly the state can play a part as well.
Representative Montgomery, what are you hearing in this larger district that you want to represent?
Yeah, with a little bit more area, you hear a lot more issues, a diversity of issues. It gets into ag, down to education, healthcare. Kind of the top one on people's minds, I think, is education ultimately. Everybody says that. I mean, and almost kind of gets old. But it's one of those things where what's important is we've got to make sure that when that kid enters kindergarten, he's going to line up to have a quality job when he leaves. Instead of just kind of going off and maybe goes to college and he racks up some debt or ends up in financial trouble, things like that. So ultimately we've got to start working on how do we line that up for individuals, and I think that's what people have in mind. They want to see that their kids have that opportunity. That goes to the jobs issue. We have to have quality jobs here. Not just the stuff that doesn't pay as well. And there's some folks here in the community that are trying to, really trying to push on that. But and hopefully at the state level, we need to support that. But so that's what I see a lot of.
And Mr. Crowley, I know you've talked about making the rounds and talking to a lot of people. What are you hearing? What do you think the needs of the district are? Senator.
I have been able to talk and connect with so many different people throughout District 32. The conversation, yes, starts with education, but that's usually when I started. It's usually off of the rams of who's my representative, who's my who's my senator. They don't know these things, and that's when you go on an average day knocking on doors, talking to people, they don't know who their representative is. They don't know who their city council person is. They don't know all of those different things that are basic information that voters lack. So first thing is we go on and we try to educate them on those certain situations, and then we try to educate them on the issues itself. Then they had come into the aspects of asking the questions about education, and then also criminal justice reform and budgeting and things like that. But realistically, I'm gonna be realistically honest with you, we do a poor job of educating our voters, and that's the lack of participation that you see.
Thank you. Education comes up a lot. Of course, it's been the big topic of the state. So let's ask, education funding really has dropped. If you adjust for inflation over the last decade or so, it's dropped by roughly 11%. Now we have a teacher pay raise and cries for more education funding. So I'm interested, just in 45 seconds or so, roughly, whether you think we need to increase general education funding beyond the teacher pay raise, whether we also need another teacher pay raise, and how would we do it? So we'll start with, let's just start with Mr. Pylon, House District 64.
Thank you. So I was just writing down about this issue. So with education, we absolutely have to fully fund it. But not just funding, we need to push for education reform as well. And the level that we need to be at is we need to be at a level where we're not so dependent on just the federal funding alone. Because that's one of the big issues is that with reform, you can only do so much because there's laws that say, well, you have to do things this certain way or else you're not going to get this money. And say if we take that away, if we say we have enough money to do it our way, we can make the rules and do it better than any other state can. And that's the level of funding we need to get to, is to where we decide, okay, we're going to do it this way that works. We don't have to worry about whether we get those grants from other people or not. So that's my answer.
Ms. McCarter, do you think we should increase education funding, and how should we go about doing that?
Definitely, we should increase education funding. If you walk into a public school, I don't think that you would disagree. If you've ever stepped foot inside of a public school, that you would disagree with that. It is a sad, sad time for our kids. We definitely need to increase it. We need to increase teacher pay raise also, but that comes in time, and teachers aren't begging. They're not banging on legislature doors anymore for a pay raise. That wasn't even what the walkout was about, essentially. It was about funding our classrooms so our kids have adequate supplies and teachers have adequate supplies, and we're not digging into our own pockets that are already stretched pretty thin. A way to do that, a few ideas, are raising the gross production tax to 7%. We know that that's not going to be around forever, but while it's here, let's take advantage of it. Let's use it. Returning our top tax bracket to what it was before Mary Fallon was governor, and once we get in there, to look for state operations that are redundant and see if we can't remove some of those that are duplicated and save some of that money.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell, should we increase education funding, and how would you produce the money?
Yes, I
If so.
think we should. I think the first step of the equation is to just increase funding generally for the classroom, and then give it a couple years after this pay raise settles, and then reevaluate where we are at on the teacher pay scale. I would eventually like to see teacher funding somewhere along the line of being top in the regional top. And then again, we need more classroom funding in general. I think the best way to do that is once we get up there, once we can actually look at the budget and see, we can see where the funding is, and if there needs to be some, then we would address it at that time, where the money needs to come from, if we had to raise additional revenue sources.
Mr. Pay.
Absolutely, to your question about education funding. And the debate that happened in the spring about House Bill 1010XX and how that was unprecedented, and all this very descriptive words. It should be normal for that type of funding. It should be normal that we fund our classrooms and pay our teachers accordingly. We have to stop playing catch up. We have to be proactive and not reactive to this kind of thing. And I think a great way to start is a state question 800 creates a vision fund and creates a way to start beginning to get ourselves off of the volatile revenue sources. It's like a roller coaster ride, our economy right now. And I've been on a roller coaster ride once in my life, never again. And we can't afford to have our economy continue to be a roller coaster ride. We got to diversify, and we have to be forward thinking about what's happening.
Mr. Bush.
Absolutely. We should fully fund education, and there are ways of doing that. One of the issues that hadn't been addressed is the classroom size. That needs to be addressed, and I think that was the main issue of the teacher walkout. So we definitely have some room to grow in funding for education. Coming up with a long-term solution, not a Band-Aid, not a one-year deal, but something that is long-term, that is sustainable, and we can look at a lot of different options. Raising the gross production tax to 7% is one thing, and also restoring the top tax rate to what it was 10 years ago. When you've taken 30% or almost $300 million worth of funding from education over the past decade, we've got a lot of catch up and a lot of work to do, but I think that's a start.
And Mr. Crowley.
Yes, we need to fully fund education by far, as well as focus more and being realistic with modern technology within the classroom. I'm in the classroom. I understand and I know the needs of the classroom. One of the things that my school has done is we have went towards not using books so much, but we're now using laptops, which is Chromebooks, and it's providing our kids a better opportunity to be successful. How to do that is raise the gross production tax to 7%, as well as in capital gains exemptions.
And Representative Montgomery.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and echo a lot of folks. Everybody wants to see more sustainable funding to the classroom. Everybody said they wanted funding to the classroom for a while now. So there's a lot of different issues and options that have to be dealt with there. Ultimately, we do have to get off of reliance on the volatile sources of revenue. We're already missing projections on our new gross production tax that we just increased. We're already missing that by 20% this current fiscal year. That report just came out today. So, for me, it's you got to get to the healthcare issues that are there. It's kind of interesting. We want to pledge GPT revenue to education, but then we'll say we want to raise Medicaid expansion, which also costs us $150 million. GPT hike is $200 million in revenue, so I guess you got $50 million for education. So ultimately, it's going to have to come down to everybody's got to get in the room and work together and collaborate. So.
Would anyone here have voted no on a teacher pay raise? Would anyone here have voted no on increasing the taxes that were increased to pay for the teacher pay raise over this last special session? No one here. Okay, just checking. You never know. Some people voted.
David, we got rid of the other
Just spoke you out.
He's not here anymore.
Okay, well, not to spend too much time on taxes, but I just want to ask about a few. So I'm just looking for quick answers here. So I'm going to go to a few of them. Mr. Pay, income tax, it's been cut by about 25% over the last, since 2004. I think it went from 6.65% to 5% on the top margin. Do you favor decreasing it further, keeping it the same, or increasing it?
So, yeah, certainly not decreasing further by no means. And they actually put a stop to that. It was scheduled to go further a few years from now, but they passed legislation on a bipartisan basis to stop that scheduled decrease. And I agree with that because I always tell people that governing is like riding a bike. When you ride a bike, you can't lean too far to the left or the right. And so when it comes to taxes, I think reducing rates has a stimulative effect on the economy, but if you reduce them too low, then you have to cut spending elsewhere, like in education and health. And that's what happened with our state. We cut them too low, and we're paying the price right now. And we have to start turning that around going forward.
Mr. Bush,
As I mentioned earlier, I think we need to restore it to what it was. We need to at least increase it back to 6%. I know it was at 6.5%. And I think the people that I've talked to who benefit from that would agree. When you start taking from our most vulnerable, our kids and our elderly, in healthcare and education, they really are interested in doing that and accepting that. So I think that's certainly something that we need to look at, and we should have looked at many years ago, in fact.
I'll ask Mr. Caldwell, would you increase the income tax to pay for education or other services, or keep it the same, or cut it?
As of right now, I'd keep it about the same.
Okay.
I would listen to proposals on either side of the issue. I haven't committed to either one, but I think as of right now, I think 5% for our state income tax is about right.
Okay. Ms. McCarter, cigarette tax. Some people want to increase it. We increased it by $1 some people per pack. Some people want to increase it another 50 cents. Are you in favor of that or opposed?
I'm going to tell you the issue why I'm torn on that is because it's proven that we know our lower socioeconomic populace is they smoke cigarettes at a higher rate than our higher socioeconomic status populace. So therefore, if we're increasing that tax on our lower socioeconomic populace, what are we doing to them? There's another side of it, though, that says that if we raise that cigarette tax, it may cut down on younger smokers, on beginning to smoke. So that's something that I would have to weigh out, and I would definitely have to talk to others about to decide, because I wouldn't want it to negatively affect people who are already struggling, but we'd have to definitely look at a way of how we're going to keep our younger people from beginning to pick up that habit.
Mr. Parlin, your view on the cigarette tax. What should we do with it? Increase it?
Back to addressing the state income tax instead.
No, I got
everything Ms. McCarter said here.
Well, cigarette tax for now.
Okay. Cigarette tax, I said before, it's a sin tax. It's an unreliable source of income, because when you push up any type of sin tax, you bring in initial revenue increase, and then it goes down over time because people start doing it less. And so if your goal is we want to make people do this less, then yes, that's a good thing. But if your goal is we're going to bring in money, then no, it's not going to work in the long term. You have to look for other sources of revenue.
Thank you. Representative Montgomery, gross production tax. Some people want to take it up to 7%. What's your view on that?
I mean, if we're going to get into the issue of sustainable revenue, I don't know that that's going to be your solution. I'm open to the discussion, but we need to actually evaluate what other states do with their gross production tax. I think it's interesting that we want to raise it and try to get more money, but we don't actually know what anybody else does. Texas puts 30% of theirs into a trust fund, or actually a rainy day fund. North Dakota puts 40% into trust funds and rainy day funds up there, because guess what? They know it's not going to last forever. Our state doesn't do any of that. You got the Vision Fund proposal out there, and everybody will say, oh, we got this Revenue Stabilization Fund. It's statutory. The legislature is going to rate it as soon as there's $1 in it. I know that. So, I'm open to the discussion, but we need to be smart about it if we're going to do it.
And Mr. Crowley, your view on the gross production tax, and you might drop in, if you wish, some thought on this vision fund. Mr. Montgomery was part of the creation of that fund, so it's related to gross production tax.
Yes, so I'll first say yes towards gross production tax, raising it to 7%. The reason why on the football field, you just don't, if something's working for you, you go and you do the things that work for you. We have got away from what we have done historically, which is have this gross production tax for oil and gas at 7%, and now we're in the foothold in this particular situation. Now we need to have that conversation and bring it back up to do it again. Also, if it's low, bring it back down to 4% and have that type of margin of having that, conversation of being able to go from 4 to 7 when it's high. With the the new vision fund, yes, you can do that. I think it's a great idea when you are in the plus, but we're not in the plus, we're in the negative. So we can't have we can't have a conversation about putting funds aside when we don't have funds to go with.
Thank you. Ms. McCarter, I wanted to ask a question. There's a lot of talk about increasing funding for education, but in the meantime, there are a lot of state agencies that have had their services cut, or they just have a lot of needs: mental health, corrections, the prisons, Department of Human Services, the library, the Historical Society, you name it. So which of those services are you going to cut out some extra revenue for besides education? What are the couple that need it the
priorities?
most? Yeah.
It'd be wonderful if we could restore it for all of them, right? But realistically, we know that's going to take some time. Outside of education, we've got to work with mental health care. We have to. Education, mental health care, and criminal justice reform go hand in hand. You cannot fund one without funding the other, period. I'll argue that until the day that I die. So those are my top two that I would look to restore first and get those fundings back to where they need to be, because once we're able to do those things and we're able to give our children and our citizens prevention and intervention, then they know better, so we do better. And we have the resources to show them and to guide them in that direction, and then they're able to obtain the education that they need. And it's a cycle that we can break as soon as we decide to start investing in it.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, what would be your other priorities besides education in terms of funding?
Right. So like I said, we need to be able to fund all of our core services. My major priorities after education are, of course, healthcare and mental health care, and also looking at infrastructure and transportation. But as far as cutting funds from anywhere else, the only place I feel like it should be cut from is government spending on government. If we can have lower pay and benefits and so on to people like us, if I get elected, I would do that if it meant more of that money was going to where it needs to be instead. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. I want to jump quickly to one healthcare question, and then we'll open questions up to the audience. This will be for everyone, so if you could just take about 30 seconds. I'll start with, let's start in the middle with Mr. Bush. Mr. Bush, Medicaid. Should we expand Medicaid and collect the hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government and kick in some of our own to cover the 14% of people in the state who are uninsured?
Yeah, we have one of the highest uninsured rates in the nation. And it's really sad to me that look at other states looking at us as if we don't care about our own people because we don't invest in our own people. You got to invest in healthcare. And when you see these hospitals closing and people don't have access to healthcare, people are dying, literally dying, because we won't accept those dollars, is heartbreaking to me, and I don't understand why we wouldn't. And I hear the argument that it costs money. Well, how much is a life worth to you? Can you put a dollar amount on someone's life?
And Mr. Pay, with Medicaid expansion.
Right. I am open to the proposal as long as it works with our state, because like I said earlier, I'm tired of playing catch up with other states that have already expanded the Medicaid program, that have already helping those with mental challenges, those who are drug addicted, because we're falling behind. And we have a lot of people here in Oklahoma, here in Lawton, that need help. And I think this would be a great way to do that. And it's, I think in other states, it's even see some bipartisan support. And so I think it's very much doable, I think, in the upcoming legislative session. Hopefully it is.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell, what's your view on Medicaid expansion?
My view is I would take it. I think it would cost the state approximately $100 million to $150 million to actually take the money with that in turn, we'd get an additional $900 million of federal funding. You put that $900 million, close to $1 billion into the Oklahoma economy. I think that money gets out there, money multiplier effect takes into effect, and would actually probably cover at least half or maybe 30% of the money that the initial expense that we're having to put out. So the match, 9 times dollars that we're getting matched with from the federal level will probably overcompensate the money that we have to expend.
Mr. Crowley.
Yes, and like Larry said, we have 14% of uninsured individuals here in the state of Oklahoma, which is a big problem. Also, we have a lot of hospitals and clinics throughout our rural community that are closing down that has to be fixed, because you're putting our rural community like a Medicine Park, a Cache, Indiahoma in a bad predicament and situation where they have to now drive or move to Lawton if they're aging, because they don't have those particular supports in order for them to be successful in the long run if something does happen. So yes, I'm all for expanding it and taking the money.
Representative Montgomery.
Yeah, there was actually a proposal a few years ago called the Medicaid Rebalancing Act of 2020 that basically did this. Partisan politics got in the way of the how to pay for it, but I mean, I supported it myself. So I think that when we do this, I'm open to how we get there to do this. We know that it's going to cost between 125 to 150 million. I think we should work out a strategy for how to get that done, because we do know that there is a coverage gap. You've got folks on Medicaid, and you have folks that qualify for regular insurance, and there's a gap there that has to be covered. So I'm open to that discussion in the healthcare realm. Yeah.
And Ms. McCarter.
I am all for accepting Medicaid expansion. I think we need to elect a legislature who is willing to work with the governor to make that happen. And just like Mr. Montgomery said, we have roughly 150,000 uninsured Oklahomans who fall into that coverage crater. So it is not, I believe as an Oklahoma citizen that ethically and fiscally we're doing a disservice to our state by not accepting it. And so to do the right thing for the people of Oklahoma, it's only right that we accept Medicaid expansion.
And Mr. Powell.
I would also support Medicaid expansion. Like it's been set up here, it's both fiscally and morally responsible to do so. I'm personally one of those people up here with no insurance, so I've been that way since I lost my father's TRICARE, since I aged out and graduated college. So I understand what the struggle is there, and there's a lot of Oklahomans who are in that same situation, and it's hard to get the health care that we might need without it. So definitely.
Thank you. This is called Obamacare. I don't think I've had a panel where everyone seemed to be in favor of it, but all right, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We have Alex on the left with a microphone, and we'll have one other person in here shortly. There's Sierra. Sorry. So just hold your hand up if you have a question for one or two of the panelists, and please keep it to one question. And this.
Hello, Mr. Montgomery. This question is for you. You are currently a state representative, and my question is, what would you suggest that is done different than what happened in the past? I'm also an educator. What is it that you would change that happened in the past? Because we had budgets then, but they weren't followed. Funds were cut. Oklahoma was cut more than any other state in the nation. So what do you suggest that you would do different?
God, there's a lot of things I do different to change. I think probably one of the things we have to look at is the discussion around how many votes it takes to actually pass a tax increase. It's kind of weird. You have the ability, it takes 3/4 to pass a tax increase, but then you can change an incentive with a simple majority. You can change, say, capital gains, or you can change the standard deduction, which is an income tax. I didn't get to get into this, but you can change the standard deduction, which effectively raises people's income taxes. And that takes a simple majority. So you have these kind of weird, things like, these inaccuracies that are in the budget that kind of hamstring the process for getting dollars where they need to go, doing the things that we need to do to pay for the core services. You know, in the past, you know, the EITC thing, I thought that was messed up. I voted against it. You know, taking that away from folks. I mean, that, you know, that in itself is kind of almost, it's representative of some of the sort of the moral, you know, issues that we have with our budget. So, you know, you can get into the income tax discussion. Was that right? You know, again, I didn't get to, you know, vote against rolling them, you know, cutting them, or anything like that. But the flip side of this is it takes a simple majority to cut taxes, but then it takes a, you know, super majority to raise them. So there's just things like that. And for me, it gets back to the budget. It's your moral document. So.
Thank you. Other questions? This gentleman in the middle.
Hi. The question is to any of our educators. The funding for our building funding, how do you feel about taking money from that to supply other things?
Okay. Ms. Carter.
Jacoby's going to agree 100%. I think it's a terrible idea. That money is made to go to our building funds, and it is just doing one more thing. We're taking from this place to cover in that place, but how are we going to go back and fill that gap when it's there? So.
Well, yeah, and if you would come willingly, just come to our schools and walk into the schools that we have here in the Lawton Public Schools, just you would see the need for change. You would see the need for revitalization and things like that we have been neglected towards our school districts for many years. And now it's, you know, lucky enough that we're getting a new elementary or middle school at Eisenhower Middle School, which is a great deal. By the way, I was the last class president there, which is kind of cool. But going on, I just think that it's time for something different. It's time for something new. We have to also allow our kids to experience different things as well as something new. They shouldn't have to have hand-me-downs on everything every time they get into a school system, and it's time for that to be changed.
And I'm going to follow up with that that invitation to the elementary schools. If you came to my elementary school, it's now 5 elementary schools combined into one. And in an elementary setting, a lot has to do, stimulus is so important for our kids. And when you walk into our school, and nobody will be mad at me at my school because they agree with me, it looks like a mental hospital. And I'm not kidding. It looks like a mental hospital because there's not even enough money. If we wanted to paint the walls ourselves, there's not even enough money for us to get paint it ourselves. So so no, leave the money where it is.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, what's your view on this? This state question, basically, that would allow building fund money to be spent on operations.
Sure. Well, it's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul is all it is. You're moving the funds around. Now we can look at how we budget the schools because we have a formula and we can look at fixing that formula to get the money to where it's needed better. But that would have to come first before you even try anything like this because otherwise it's just not going to work at all. That's a simple answer.
Thank you. Other questions?
This question is for everyone on the panel. We are living right now in a time where people are divided, and a lot of it is division along party lines. And especially with the recent Supreme Court nomination process, I think it's only done more to divide the country. And there's a lot of blame and finger pointing from one party to another. So my question is that personally and professionally, what has your greatest mistake been or your greatest failure, and how have you been able to learn from that? Because it would be nice to see people owning up to some of the things that they have not necessarily done well, especially in terms of serving their constituents or serving the nation at large, and just for them to own that and to be able to show us citizens how they have been able to learn from that and to rise up against that.
Good question. Thank you. Most of the folks up here haven't been in office, but Mr. Bush, for example, If you're in office, what can you do to tone down, to dial back the polarization, even in the state of Oklahoma, which is very polarized over the last year?
Yeah, it really has, and it's disappointing. I think we have to work together and we have to unite one another, and it starts with leadership. And I think myself, I've been in a leadership position majority of my life, and so I know how to lead. And you don't lead with criticizing people. You lead by reaching your hand out to them and helping them and complimenting them and building them up. I think leadership starts with people that make people around them better. And that's something we have to concentrate and focus on. And I think that will bring us together, and I think we'll get more done if we work that way. Maybe reach across the aisle, and so
Okay.
that's what I
Thank you. Mr. Pei, thoughts on that? On polarization and...
Like I said earlier, for me, governing is like riding a bike. You can't lean too far to the left or the right, and you're absolutely right in your question that we have become so divided. Like, I have friends who don't even speak to each other anymore because of their political preferences. I don't believe that you should assume the absolute worst in someone because of their political preferences. I told my team from the beginning, how we run our campaigns can be indicative of how we are as a representative. And I told my team, I want to include everyone in this process. So I reached out to Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We gotten support from across the political spectrum. We gotten support from people from all disciplines and all walks of life. And that's how I intend to govern, is by including everyone in my decision-making process, other legislators, constituents. And as far as the second part of your question about adversity, to be honest, if you looked at me 10 years ago, this is not something that I would be doing. I was a very shy, reserved kid growing up. I had trouble transitioning from elementary to middle school. I was bullied, and I for a long time I did not have a voice. And it's because of my mom and dad, because of some very close neighbors, I found my voice. And that's what ultimately led me to get involved in politics, because I want to find a voice for other people who need someone to advocate for them, regardless of who you are. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, it doesn't matter. You're all Lawtonians, you're all Oklahomans, and we're all Americans at the end of the day.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell.
So one thing that I've said, and I've said it at the forum that we had at Cameron during the primary process, and I even said it during the primary process to go kind of went against my campaign manager and consultant, and I've always said this, is Republicans, even though I'm a Republican and that's the party that I affiliate with, we don't have a monopoly on good ideals. We really don't. I mean, so I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in our country today is the polarization and the factionalism. George Washington famously said in his farewell address to the nation after his 8 years as president, he said, there's only one thing that could ever tear our country asunder, and that is the advent of extreme factionalism, which is what we call political parties today. So one thing that I've always advocated for since I was a door knocker when I was 16 years old, knocking for Andrew Rice when he ran as a Democrat. He ran for the United States Senate, or when I worked for Romney when he ran against President Obama in 2012. I've always had this ideal that I think we need to reach across the aisle. We need to have a consensus. We need to work with people that have different ideals and different backgrounds than we do. And just because someone has a differencing of opinion doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. It just means that we need to talk to them and to try to understand and empathize with them.
Thank you. Good points. I'd like to, just before I turn you to another audience question, I'd like to quickly ask, I guess I'll start with Representative Montgomery, criminal justice reform. Seems like everyone's in favor of it. It's like, why even ask? Everyone, conservatives, Republicans, liberals. But the question is, when you get down to brass tacks, a few questions. There's proposals to increase the number of inmates in private prisons. We want to issue bonds to build more prisons. These are some of the difficult, specific questions. What do you specifically think we need to do to further criminal justice reform, assuming that you're in favor of that? 45 seconds.
Yeah, 45 seconds. There's a lot there. When you get into the statutory stuff, I'm going to give you guys a real good example. A year or two ago, there was this bill that was hailed as a great criminal justice reform. We're going to, reduce all the minimal or maximums and things like that. And then you get into all the things that they were changing, and I'll give you an example, and maybe the gentleman's point earlier about the crimes that we have. If you're a sex offender, you can't be an ice cream truck driver. You know, that's on the books in the state of Oklahoma. You get into those kinds of things. When it comes to like private prisons and things like that, ultimately the laws on the books have enabled that situation. Our deficiency of funding mental health and drugs, you know, substance abuse, you know, drug courts and those kinds of things, that has enabled that situation. So to me, you have to kind of go to the root of the problem. You got to focus in on, you know, getting that mental health and substance abuse assistance. That's what Texas did. They were very successful at this. They shut down a lot of prisons. So that's that. You know, there's just a lot there, and we have to get into the details.
Mr. Crowley.
Well, I first think that in order for you to fix that, you have to be realistic in understanding the problem at hand. By far, knowing the biggest problem within substance abuse and one of the biggest contributors towards people being incarcerated. We've been ranked #1 in the nation for women in incarceration for almost 20 years, and we've been up to 1 and 2. And we've always talked about we need to fix some certain things within our criminal justice system, but it's never done. It's a great talking point, but we need action towards that. Action is something what Governor Fallon did 2 years ago when taking all you convicted felon off of applications at the state level. We need to do that at the municipal level because we're in a big crisis here in the state of Oklahoma when 1 out of 4 people are somewhat connected with the criminal justice system. So those are realistic problems that we have to fix, and those are things that I'm willing to do when I'm elected, if elected.
Thank you. Let's go to the question from the woman in the back.
Yes, I just recently experienced having a parent in a nursing home, and this is all new to me. And as you all know that have experienced this already, they have to get rid of everything they own, their car, their home, their retirement funds, and they're reduced to having like $50 a month. And so that leaves the burden of the family, which is me and my sister, to care for the needs of my mom, which is hard when you don't make very much money here. And so I was just wondering, is there anything that any of you could do about that to raise that $50 allowance? I don't know how long it's been $50, but things have changed. And if there's anything that you can do, and are you willing to do?
Is there anyone?
David, can I take this one?
Sure, go ahead.
So I went through this, literally buried my dad 10 days ago, but we went through that process with him starting in February. They call it the spin down, and then you have the look back period. You basically, essentially, to be able to afford to go into a nursing home facility, you have to make them a ward of the state. And when that happens, that's where you get the $50 a day, the spending allowance and stuff of that nature. It's a problem. It's one thing that I think a lot more and more people are going to have to deal with as the baby boomers get older. We're going to have to deal with it and address it, and that's something on my forefront of my thought. It's one of my tertiary issues that I will be advocating for. I don't have all the answers right now, and if anybody else up here has solutions for it, I'd love to hear it. But that's one thing that I want to work for, because a family like that, what you've had to go through and what I had to go through, I think there should be an easier avenue. There should be something more that can be done. We have a part of our social covenant and contract when we as a people give power to government, is that government protects the people, especially our elderly, our sick and afflicted that can't take care of themselves.
Thank you. Other question? Sure, go ahead.
This is kind of partially gets to one of the other issues about Medicaid in particular. We talk about Medicaid expansion and getting more coverage to people, but the other part of the dialogue is about the Medicaid provider rate. This is the rate that nursing homes and things like that are reimbursed at to provide coverage to folks. And Oklahoma's done well-ish, except for the last few years. Go figure. That was kind of part of the cuts, is you cut the provider rate, and so effectively that reduces the amount that these guys are reimbursed to take care of those kinds of things. So, and again, that gets to your budget. If I promise Medicaid expansion and I spend $150 million to do that, well, I haven't done anything for the provider rate. It's still, like 89% of Medicare or whatever it's reimbursing at. So that's a whole nother aspect that's behind Medicaid that doesn't get talked about the way it should. So.
Thank you. Other questions?
Okay. My question has to do, it goes back to incarceration. How do you feel about school to prison pipeline? School to prison pipeline begins in kindergarten. Would you be amenable to setting a program, to doing something to work to eliminate school to prison pipeline? If you are not familiar with it, I can get that information to you.
Ms. McCarter, you have any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Mr. Crowley, that's fine.
No, you can go first.
Okay, Ms. McCarter first.
Such a gentleman. Yeah, I would do everything in my power to get rid of it. And I think that if our school systems were set up in a way that was intended for our kids to be successful from the beginning, we wouldn't even be talking about it.
Mr. Pylon, what's your view on that? Anything specific we can do?
Sure. Yeah, that's why, like I was saying, we have to have both education reform and criminal justice reform. Like Mr. Carter was just saying, you set it up early on that they're not going to go that path. They're going to go the path of success. And then even when they get out, into the world, like Mr. Crowley was saying earlier, we have all these minor crimes that people get arrested and thrown away for. Possession is the biggest one in Oklahoma. And I just don't understand why. And that's why I was saying I'm going to look at the laws specifically, which ones do we need to have repealed or amended. That's part of what I'd be looking at. But you start with the education reform, you fix the schools, and then you look at the criminal justice reform and getting that part fixed as well. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Okay, just 30 seconds.
just
You're
30
both
seconds.
educators. You can't have
30
double up on
seconds.
the educators.
Well, I work at an alternative school, and I see it on a daily basis when it comes to school to prison pipeline. One of the things that you need to do to fix that problem is stop building prisons at third grade reading scores. That's how you fix that problem. Because the biggest thing that you're running into right now is that they're already starting the process of this person is going to be a criminal at third grade. I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. I had struggled reading all the way until I was in 5th grade. So I probably was on that list. And lucky enough, I didn't go down that road. But it's one of those deals of saying everybody is not fortunate enough to get out of those situations and those environments. So sometimes you also have to have some type of program set up to provide them that type of mentorship and those extracurricular activities and things that they don't have at the household.
Can I
Thank you.
follow that up one more time?
We got to move on.
We have to?
Yeah.
Find me after
Sorry.
this is over.
They can catch you afterward, but just a quick question I'll interject here. Corporate tax incentives, business incentives, there are many of them in Oklahoma. Lawton may benefit from some, I don't know, but there are, you name them, quality jobs, capital gains really is a corporate tax benefit. There's one for tire manufacturers. You just drive up the road and you'll see the factories, or even in Norman. So, Mr. Bush, do you think we need to cut back on these incentives or limit them, reduce them? We've tried, but the commission that was put together didn't do a lot.
Yeah, I think it's something that we certainly need to look at because a lot of these incentives that we're giving out, we're not getting that revenue back. And so we have to look at those by a case-by-case basis on the incentives that we're giving out to these companies and these corporations and assure that the incentive and the money that we're giving out to them, we're seeing back in revenue into our economy. So it's certainly something that we have to look at, and it may be a case-by-case basis, but it's certainly something that we can't just keep going on, giving incentive at the incentive and not get that money back into our economy.
Are there any specific ones that you would think are questionable?
You'd mentioned here about the tire. That could be a start. Goodyear's been good to us, so that may not be a good one. I wouldn't start with that one. But there are some different corporations, different companies that have come into the state. I don't want to name any specifically, if that's what you're trying to nail me down on.
Just
Get me in
asking.
trouble here. Dave, come on, Dave.
I know, it's a NIMBY
It's supposed to be
thing, yeah.
bipartisan.
No, non-partisan. Mr. Pay, your thoughts on corporate incentives, tax incentives?
Well, I agree with Larry. Like, you got to do a common sense approach, look at it holistically, do an evaluation. Is it bringing something back? Is it bringing back jobs to the community? If not, eliminated. And as far as specific ones, I think David mentioned he read through the state budget, so I might have to consult with him on specific ones. But I would certainly consult with people like him, the experts, on which incentives work best for the state.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? There's a gentleman on the far right, my right, who has a question.
Yes, my question does have kind of something to do with that and tax incentives. State Question 800, where it ties portion of the GPT to investments. Do you think that is a problem where we're giving tax incentives to companies that we have stock in? Would that be something that would, for all y'all?
That's kind of an interesting question because the state's pension systems, the Commissioners in the Land Office, TSET, all of these things have investments in companies that may or may not be investing in the state of Oklahoma. The point of having that is so that we actually generate investment and income and returns that actually replace revenue, because otherwise you get a situation where the only thing they can buy is United States Treasuries, which is what the Social Security system does, and they get a very bad return on their money. This is part of the reason why the trust fund is actually going broke. So yes, you have to have that to an extent. We've put caps on it. You have to have a prudent investor rule. You have to have transparency. I mean, we already have these kinds of things out there to have transparency on. So we put a cap on, there's a scenario we envisioned where people would want to borrow all the money in the fund and go pay off debts for cities and counties in the state of Oklahoma. We put a cap on that kind of thing, which is being wildly misconstrued by a lot of folks, including the governor, as to what his purpose is. So the idea is to cap us from, just blowing and going with all this money. So you have to have a diversified fund. It's the same way that the pensions work. Again, the CLO, TSET. I mean, it's just standard investment policy, really. So, yeah, I guess you can get into the discussions around like, we don't like that company so because they do this business, so should we invest in them? We didn't get into that. I don't think that's a good idea. It's not working out for the places that are trying it. So
okay.
Anyway.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, question for you. There are very few women in the legislature, and really women in Oklahoma, at least there's a great belief that they're at a huge disadvantage in the economy, in the rate of deaths of women in domestic violence. What can the legislature do to try and address this very complicated problem? Any thoughts or ideas on what we might look at or consider?
Sure. So that is a very complex question. It's a complex issue. The main things there, the economy and also criminal justice reform, like I was talking about, because both of those issues affect women and especially single mothers and people like that disproportionately. So I totally understand that. I came from a background where my mom was doing most of the raising of me, and she definitely struggled economically with the lack of good jobs around here. And we had run-ins, with the local police saying, well, you're not doing a good enough job taking care of those kids, we might take them away. And so we need to look in more social programs for helping women, helping single mothers, making sure they're supported. A lot of that does happen at the local level, but the state just fixing our economy and fixing our criminal justice reform can help along with that as well.
Thank you. Ms. McCarter, what would be your 2 or 3 things you would like to see done in the legislature that would benefit women in general?
Women in general, for sure. Initiatives focused towards women that are realistic. Again, Mr. Crowley's made statements, that say, talk is talk, but we've got to put it to action. We've got to find people invested in our local communities through state initiatives, willing to support women, particularly single women and women of color. It has to be done. I work with a lot of young single mothers. It's generational. It's all they know. If we're not taking steps to provide opportunities for them and educate them, then nothing's ever going to change. It is on the backs of us who know better to teach them and to provide them those ways. So it starts with initiatives at the state level, and then we put that down and we carry that down to each community and make that a local thing. And really, we must really invest in it, though. It's one thing to sit up here and say that, but if we don't have somebody in office who's willing to put the work in and invest in it, it's not ever going to change.
Thank you. Other questions in the audience? Well, we need to move on. We're close to. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Yes, I had a question about something earlier that y'all was just talking about. My question is how can we as people in the community get our voices heard? Because the Supreme Court has said that corporations are considered people, and so much money is being pushed into the political system, and it controls, in my opinion, a lot of the people who are getting elected. So how do everyday people like us get our voices heard when we come see you guys at the state capitol? How do we know that you guys are going to do what we ask?
Mr. Crowley, and there's implicit references here to dark money and just the huge amount of money, even flowing into Oklahoma in some cases.
I just have one word: vote.
That's it.
That's the only way that you can get, because the biggest problem that you run into, and this is not myself, I'm not an elected official, I haven't been approached by dark money. I'm just going to be really honest with you. But if it ever happened, it would be turned away. The one reason why, because my mom raised me right on the aspects of saying, I got elected for a reason, to represent the people, and I'm going to be the candidate and the representative of the people. But in order for you to fix that problem and make sure that these elected officials are held accountable is by voting. That's it.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell, any thoughts on...
Right. So, I mean, I think this is coming from a former college kid that had no money. So what did I do? So I started knocking doors. Find a candidate early in the process that you like, that you agree with, that you want to see move forward, and start working for them. Maybe you don't have $1,000 or $500 or even $100 to give them, but maybe you can give them a Saturday. Be involved in the process, be knowledgeable, go out there and register 10 of your friends, whether they're Democrats, independents, but the more people that we get involved in the process and then talk in the process, and we saw this even within our own Republican Party during this last primary season, people got involved that normally weren't involved, and it made a difference. We got rid of a lot of the platform caucus. We got more people that are not as dogmatic. So I think a lot of the times the guys with the most money didn't win this last time. It's one of the first times recently in Oklahoma history, especially in a primary setting. So I think the best thing that you can do is be active. Go to your candidate, find your candidate, get a cell phone number.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to give you their cell phone, that's one thing that I do. To every piece of literature I send out, it's my personal cell phone. I've had people call me, I was just calling you just to see if it was real.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's real. Oh, okay, well, I didn't need nothing. Okay, well, the thing is, we need politicians that have the attitude that they don't get up on a stage and pontificate, but they have 37,000 bosses. And you do that by getting involved early, pick a candidate early, work for them, volunteer, get people to register to vote,
Okay.
and then stay active. Don't let us off the hook after November 6th.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Any question from this side of the room? I've got so many from this side, but you don't have to ask a question, just want to make sure. Pardon? Oh, sure. You're taking privilege? Go ahead. You've got 30 seconds. No, go ahead.
So minimum wage, this period between the last minimum wage increase has been the longest period without a minimum wage increase since it was enacted in 1938. And studies show that the minimum wage today is actually worth less than it was in 1968. So if elected, would you raise the minimum wage? Why or why not?
Representative Montgomery, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of discussion on this up there. We preempted cities from doing it. Well, they preempted cities from doing it a few years ago. For me, I I don't see a lot of benefit here in Oklahoma. I mean, the cost of living in different places is just different. In Seattle, it's a lot more expensive up there. Ironically, they raised it to $15 an hour. You have a lot of companies like Amazon that are finally figuring out that, hey, maybe we should pay our people a little bit better. I think that's ultimately part of it. Unemployment being where it's at, that's going to start pushing wages up by itself because these guys are going to have to start competing. So I don't know that I mean, because I put it at $9 and then it's 5 years and then I got to change it again. I mean, it's kind of, I don't know that there's much of a benefit for most folks. Ultimately, you have to be able to have the jobs that actually already pay above. I mean, Goodyear, they pay way above minimum wage. You know, you have to go for those kinds of things if you want to raise the incomes that folks have. You have to be able to be a place that they want to invest their capital, put a manufacturing plant, and those kinds of things for them to have those, you know, for folks to have those kinds of quality jobs. So I just don't see a lot of benefit for most folks.
Mr. Crowley, what's your response?
Yes, and the reason why you can't live off of $750. I'm gonna be realistically honest with you. If you're doing 40 hours a week in that process of trying to work a full-time job, you possibly get around roughly $1,300 or something like that a month, and it's just not reasonable. You can't do it. It's hard to do, especially if you're by yourself. Because I've also lived off of $750. I've actually had a job outside of teaching and coaching. I worked at the shoe department. I said, hey, what size shoe do you wear? Because that was realistic, and that's what I had at that moment in time. I remember having a conversation with my students, and we, did the math. And some of my students said, hey, I don't want to go to college. Okay, sure. You don't want to go to college. So what do you want to do? Well, right now I'm doing this. And I go, well, this is how much it pays. And this is how much your paycheck's going to look at the end of the month. And it then had a realistic conversation. Like, they really had a eye moment, like, oh, I have to do something different. So I want to make sure that, our citizens in this district, as well as in the state of Oklahoma, are provided with the best opportunity to be successful and not shortchanged.
Thank you. There was a woman here who's been wanting to ask a question.
Hi, yes, my question actually was from the previous question, and this is for everyone on the panel. If you are elected, would you be willing to go against your party if you did not agree with them? Because we have to reach across, I see something going on here. We have to be able to reach across party lines.
Okay, we'll go through the whole panel, but you got like 15 seconds. So start with Mr. Caldwell.
Yes.
Well, that's pretty clear.
My loyalty lies to the district.
Can I ditto that? Because yes, that's been my stance all along, is I'm here to represent the people of District 64, not just the Democrats of District 64. So I'm willing to work across party lines to whatever benefits the state.
Thank you. I'll just quickly interject. It's easier said than done. When the party leaders start putting pressure on you or threaten to bottle your bill up, that your favorite bill your constituents love in a committee, suddenly the picture changes. Mr. Pilon.
I'm an independent. The only group I'm working for is constituents. So I'll work with either party. Whoever has the best ideas, I'll get it done. Thank you.
Mr. Bush.
Absolutely. I'm applying for a job for my constituents. So that's my number one priority. And my job is I own a business. I'm a business owner. So,
Mr. Peck.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the pressures related to governing, and some people compare it to being in the lion's den. Well, my name is Daniel, and so I think that's gonna help tremendously if I get elected.
I'm glad we didn't have somebody named Moses on the panel today. Go ahead, Mr. Crowley.
Yes, by far, yes. That's the type of person I am. I'm already, outspoken sometimes, so yes, I will go against anything like that.
And Representative Montgomery, you're in office, so you know what it's like. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I think, and you have to be able to do that when you need to for your people. But I think to me, the more important issue too is that you do have to be able to work with folks to get, to advance the goal, to move the ball here, get things moving for people. You can't just be against things. That to me is the more important issue, is being for things, being for a vision, being for a strategy, and working with folks to get that done. That Vision Fund bill passed unanimously. That's Democrats and Republicans up there. So that to me is more important, is working together with other folks and getting things done.
All right, we'll take one more question from the audience. That anyone who hasn't asked a question. From this side, okay.
And this is for everyone. I believe that the crime rate in Oklahoma was discussed. What do you all feel like are the two biggest factors that are impacting the crime rate here?
Well, we're close to closing, so I'll probably have to keep it to two responses, but
It's on my platform.
go ahead. Sure.
All right. So, and I've been saying this for 5 years. When I ran the first time 5 years ago, Lawton has a historically high crime rate after the crackdown in Juarez a couple of years ago. Murders per 1,000 and crimes against violent crimes against women are actually higher in Lawton than they are in Juarez. So we have to address it. And how do you address it? Now, there are all types of Band-Aids. We can fund law enforcement more. We should do that. We should make sure our justice department has the ability to go after violent criminals and make sure they are locked up and put away. But the real root of the matter is there's only one way to really stop it, and that's by giving people economic opportunity. How do you do that? There's only one way that's ever been proven to have a direct correlation, and that is good education. And that's why we need education funding in Oklahoma. That's why we need to be trying to be, instead of being number 1 or 2 in incarceration, we need to try to be number 1 or number 2 in education. And I'll guarantee you the symptom of properly funding our education will be that our crime rate will go down.
Mr. Bush, any thought on?
Trey, he hit the nail on the head. It all comes back to education. And that's where it starts, begins, and ends, with education and economic opportunity. Studies show the more education you have, the more educated you are, the more income that you're going to obtain. So just to piggyback off what he said, that's what I agree.
Thank you. I'd like to end the discussion by asking each candidate to spend around 30 seconds differentiating yourself from your opponent. So we'll start with Mr. Crowley.
Well, hi again, and thank y'all all for coming out, and again, thank you for having it. Oklahoma Watch, as well as Together Oklahoma, for having this particular forum. It's great to see so many different people here and learning more about us. One of the reasons why I ran for the state senate was off the reasons that we need a leadership. We need a leader in the state senate. We also need someone that's going to step up towards their party as well as towards the opposite party and actually, get some things done. And that's the biggest problem that we're running into is just leadership. So for me, I'll be your leader. I'll be your representative at the next level.
Thank you. Representative Montgomery, how are you different from your opponent?
Well, I think it kind of speaks for itself. I'm the only elected official up here. Almost half of the legislature is going to be thrown out through term limits and everything else this year. You're going to have folks that actually know what's going on, the intricacies of the budget, things like that, to advance our interests here in this community. I think that's kind of one of the issues there. It's ultimately it's going to boil down to who's in the room to advocate for you, to make the decisions that need to be made to get the things done that we need to get done. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pay. In House District 62, I'm really curious in this race. How are you different from your opponent?
Absolutely, and thank you so much to everyone for coming out this evening. The reason why I ran for office is because this is my home. I was born and raised here in Lawton. My family has strong roots here, and I bring to the table a lot of experience when it comes to knowing about how local, state, and federal government processes work. And so I wouldn't have a steep learning curve. I wouldn't be lost up there at the Capitol. I would know my way around, know what the process is to get legislation passed, and I offer a pragmatic version of governing, because this is a very diverse system. You have to include everyone in the process and get things done for everyone.
Thanks. And Mr. Bush, you're done.
I have issues. People ask me, well, why is your opponent running? We haven't been able to find anything on him. I have issues. In education, I've always said that education is the most important job that we have, and I've been volunteering and giving money, donating time to education for the past 15 years. So I've been giving back to the community and trying to improve education, trying to improve the quality of lives for our youth. I mentor several kids, and I've been doing that for the past 15 years. So I've been giving back to the community and trying to make things better here. I'm not sure what my opponent has done for our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McCarter, Mr. Pylon, of course, the incumbent is not here this evening, but you could speak to how you would differentiate yourself.
Well, aside from the obvious, being a woman and a mother, I'm a single mother. I think that brings a whole new insight into a whole new perspective up at the Capitol. And one, as a single mother, we are a huge population here in Oklahoma, and we need that representation at the Capitol. Number one, I'm an educator. Who better than to put at the Capitol people who are in the classroom and in the buildings and know what the issues are. And thirdly, I think that it's important that if you are elected and you are the representative, that you're up there, that we're authoring bills of substance other than bills that just recognize a day on the calendar. So I think it's about putting somebody up there with substance to make some changes for our district.
Thank you. Mr. Pylon, other than just being an independent, how do you differentiate yourself?
That's a really tough question. I agree with a lot of what Ms. McCarter here says, and Representative Worthen isn't here to defend himself, so I can't really say anything about him. But as for what sets me personally apart unique, other than just being an independent, I'm also not PAC sponsored or funded. I've been funding almost this entire campaign out of my own pocket, and oh man, it is a lot of money. I had more. I'm blanking on it right now.
Thanks. And Mr. Caldwell, your opponent, Ms. Gableman, Joan Gableman, is not here, but how would you differentiate yourself as a candidate for legislature?
So my opponent, she's a great educator. She is a great principal, and so I know we agree on a lot of educational processes. Maybe some of the stuff that we would differ on is, and I haven't really heard her position on is maybe how we get there, the path that we take to get to the solution. I think we both have the same goal in mind, and without her being here to talk about it, I don't want to really talk about that, but I can tell you about me. I'm a very, my time's up. Look us up on Facebook. We're on Facebook. We're also at caldwell4ok.com, so thank you.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank all of you. Please give them a hand of applause for